Değerli misafirler, kıymetli izleyiciler, Saha İstanbul adına hepinizi selamlıyor, hoş geldiniz diyorum. Efendim bildiğiniz gibi fuarımız sadece fiziki varlığıyla değil, aynı zamanda yoğun programıyla izleyicisine değer katacak birçok etkinliği barındırıyor.
Intense way of creating this area. We are inviting also keynote speakers today. Today, our guests is dealing with European Alpine Space Ventures co-founder, which has also worked in different areas of air and space. So in order to deliver his experiences, I'd like to invite Mr. Bülent Altan to the floor to deliver his keynote speech.
Turkish introduction, I'm going to have to excuse myself. I'm probably a lot more fluid in English, but also I was thinking maybe quite a bit more international interest here into the expo. So I'm going to do all of this in English if you allow me. So, distinguished guests, fellow industry leaders, friends, günaydın. It's a privilege to be here in Istanbul at Saha in a year when this exhibition has grown to over 1,700 companies from more than 120 countries. To stand under the Space Dome on what is now Europe's largest defense and aerospace cluster, to be asked to speak about sovereignty in space, for me, this is not just a professional honor, it's a personal one. Let me start by setting one thing straight because it tends to get mixed up quite a bit. I'm not a German-born Turkish engineer. I'm an Istanbul-born Turk. My parents were here, professors at the Technical University. The city raised me. The fact that I later studied in Munich and Stanford and built my career in Los Angeles and across Bavaria, none of that changes where I'm from. I'm the product of an Istanbul home, of two Turkish academics who taught me that engineering is a calling, not just a profession. So when I speak tonight about Turkey becoming a backbone of the new space industry, I am not speaking as a foreign expert who came to give advice. I'm speaking as one of you. Now, what does that have to do with anything? It has to do with this. For the last 20 years, I've spent my professional life building, then funding, the most consequential transformation in space since the Apollo program. At SpaceX, I led the avionics organization. The flight computers, the radios, the software, the architecture, everything on Falcon 1, Falcon 9, every Dragon, every Starlink satellite that flies today, they were my domain. I was one of the handful of people who got to define what flies. And my signature is on those vehicles more than anyone else, more than most other people's. I tell you that not to impress you, but for one specific reason. When the first Turkish astronaut climbed into the Crew Dragon in January 2024, the avionics that kept him alive on that ascent system, I helped architect. When Turksat 6A, Turkey's first fully indigenous communication satellite, which made us the 11th country in the world that can build a geostationary spacecraft separated from a Falcon 9, second stage in July 2024, the same is true. So when I speak about how nations achieve sovereignty in space through private companies, I'm not theorizing. I helped write the playbook from the inside the building, and I have now spent 5 years on the other side of the table as a venture capitalist, trying to fund the founders who will write the next chapter of it. I will speak about 30 minutes or so, and I hope we have some amount of extra time, it seems like, just to have some questions and answers. Let's move on. First, a story you think you know, but I will tell you the parts that matter for tonight. When I joined SpaceX, that was 2004, the company was not a giant it is today. By the summer of 2008, after 3 consecutive failures of the Falcon 1 rocket, we had weeks of cash left. The conventional wisdom in Washington and in Los Angeles was that SpaceX was a vanity project. Boeing and Lockheed had merged their rocket business into United Launch Alliance, and ULA effectively had a monopoly on US government launches. The cost of putting a satellite to orbit on an Atlas or a Delta was over $400 million a rocket. The supplier base ran into more than 1,000 subcontractors. The architecture of how America accessed space had been written in the 1960s, and nobody in the established system thought it could be rewritten. What changed, it was not a government program. What changed it was a private company driven by personal conviction that the cost of access to space was the single greatest constraint on humanity becoming a multi-planetary species. That conviction sounds quaint now. In 2008, in defense and aerospace circles, it sounded ridiculous. The fourth Falcon 1 reached orbit in September 2008. And here's the most important thing I will say tonight, because it goes to the heart of the sovereignty question. The United States government did not save SpaceX with a cost-plus development program. The US government saved SpaceX by being a customer. In December 2008, NASA awarded us the $1.6 billion commercial resupply services program to get 12 cargo missions to the International Space Station. NASA did not specify how to build a Falcon 9. NASA did not seat 100 people into SpaceX and tell how to direct engineering. NASA simply said, deliver cargo to my station on these dates, on this price, and to these safety standards. And we delivered. Everything that flows from that one structural decision. We vertically integrated. We built roughly 70% of every Falcon 9 in-house. I will give you one example because I lived it. In the established defense industry, a flight gate radio cost about $100,000. We were buying them. They were a budget killer. And frankly, the latency and reliability numbers weren't there. So we sat down, my team and I, and we built our own. The replacement cost us $5,000, 20 times less, and was demonstrably more reliable. We did this 50 times more across the rocket. That is vertical integration, actually what looks like. It is not a slogan. It's 50 engineers refusing to accept what aerospace told them was the only way to do things. And then reusability. Over 500 booster landings as of last month. And then the flywheel, launch cadence enabled Starlink, and Starlink revenue funded Starship. Today, the picture is quite staggering. SpaceX flew 170 launches in 2025, 165 Falcon 9s, and 5 Starships, with 100% payload delivery success on Falcon 9. That is roughly 85% on all US orbital launches in a single year. The Starlink constellation crossed 10,000 active satellites in March 2026, 65% of every active satellite in orbit. Subscribers crossed 10 million in February. Starlink revenue was approximately $10 billion in 2025, and it's operating profit engine of the company. The most recent Pentagon Phase 3 contract awarded SpaceX $5.9 billion for 28 national security missions through 2029, plus a separate $2 billion Golden Dome award. Cumulative federal contracts since the company started are over $24 billion. Now here's the part that is not being fully digested in this region. In December 25, SpaceX moved into its IPO process. The most recent insider tender was at $800 billion valuation. The IPO itself, expected mid this year, is being marketed at $1.5 trillion, maybe even 1.75. That would make it the largest public offering in human history, larger than Saudi Aramco. And in a deliberate choice, SpaceX is reportedly allocating 30% of the IPO to retail investors, 3 times the Wall Street norm. That tells you everything about who America thinks should own sovereign space backbone going forward. Not the government, not the institutions, the American public. Think about what that does. The taxpayers, who through NASA and the Pentagon have been anchor customers of SpaceX for 15 years, are about to become the equity holders of SpaceX. That is the trickle down. That is the alignment. That is what it looks like when private capital and sovereign anchor demand braid together to produce a national strategic capability that by any honest accounting is now the dominant operational space power on Earth. The United States did not architect this. A private founder did. The United States bought it, and now the American public is buying it. That is the first lesson, and we will come back to it. I left day-to-day operations at SpaceX a few years ago. Then I went to do something that in honesty almost no one thought was possible. I went to a tiny German startup called Mynaric in Munich, 20-something people, L optical communications terminal, a market that was supposed to belong to American defense primes. I will not give you the long version. The short version is this. By the time I left, Mynaric supplied more than 3/4 of the optical communications terminals of the Space Development Agency, tranche backbone, the laser comms backbone of the entire next generation US military. We were a German company with a German engineering team supplying the most strategic communications layer of the United States military space architecture and outcompeting every American optical supplier on cost, on schedule, and on capability. We had taken the company through a NASDAQ IPO. We had won contracts from Northrop Grumman, York Space, Rocket Lab. The engineering team in Munich had achieved what most people in the industry said it was structurally impossible for a startup of that size, and certainly impossible for a German one. I left after that. And then something happened that I want every Turkish official in this room to listen to carefully. Because it is the central cautionary tale of European space sovereignty. Germany failed to do the one thing it was supposed to do. Germany did not become a customer. Germany kept tinkering. Development programs, studies, roadmaps, anchor commitment, none. Multi-year purchase orders, none. The company that German engineering had built into dominant supplier of the American military backbone could not get a serious procurement order from its own government. And so, after my departure, with no domestic anchor demand for us to stabilize cash flow, Mynaric ran into financial difficulty. It went into restructuring, and just 3 weeks ago, Rocket Lab, an American company, completed the acquisition of Mynaric for $150 million. $300 million of capital had gone into building it. The buyer paid that half that, took the technology, the engineering team, and the contracts. Germany built the assets. Germany lost the assets. Why? Because Germany did not know how to be a customer. That sentence is the entire indictment of the old European model of space industrial policy. And it is warning for every nation in this room. The Mynaric story is the European new space cautionary tale, and we'll come back to that later when we talk about Turkey. After Mynaric, with my co-founder Yoram and a team of operators, we founded Alpine Space Ventures. Our first fund closed at 170 million euros in 2021 and currently is performing at roughly a 3x multiple on invested capital. And we are now building our fund 2 with 280 million euro target. Both funds invest in a single thesis, that the strategic space industrial base, launch, satellite buses, propulsion, ground station, in-space services, the supply chain underneath it all, is the most important industrial sovereignty question over the next 20 years. And it can only be solved by a wave of well-capitalized, operator-led private companies on both sides of the Atlantic. Let me give you a sense what that thesis looks like in the portfolio, because every one of these companies plays a sovereignty role. K2 Space in Torrance, California is building what they call the mega class satellite bus. 3 meters by 3 meters of the payload deck, 20 kilowatts of power, 10 times of what any other commercial bus in its class delivers, designed to operate across LEO, MEO, GEO, and cislunar space. Northwood Space, also in Los Angeles, is building the next generation ground station network, the antenna farms that satellite constellations actually need to. Today, sovereign nations pay either foreign primes for ground access or do not get a reliable ground link at all. Northwood is rebuilding the ground segment from first principles, the way SpaceX rebuilt launch. Constellar in Karlsruhe and Munich is the European Earth observation company doing thermal infrared imaging of agriculture, of water. Sovereign food security and water management are not abstract policy goals. Constellar is the platform underneath them. Reflex Aerospace in Munich is building European satellite platforms for institutional and commercial customers, the kind of fast iteration that European militaries will need for Iris Square and its successors to actually populate. And many more. Every one of these companies is, in different layers, the sovereign infrastructure of tomorrow. And I'm also the chairman of ESR Aerospace, the Munich-based launcher that in March 2025 became the first privately developed European company to attempt orbit. The first flight ended after 30 seconds. The qualification flight is in final preparation as we speak. ESA selected ESAR alongside RFA and a few others for the European Launcher Challenge with up to 170 million euros available per company. We will come back to whether that is enough. Now let me say something that is unpopular in Brussels and in Paris. Europe is not one sovereign space ecosystem. Europe is two space ecosystems, and they are pointed in opposite directions. On one side, you have the new space Europe. Germany has emerged, almost without anyone noticing, as home of the European new space. ESAR, RFA, Constellar, Reflex, Blackwave, Mynaric, until it was lost. Italy is leaning in. Avio is talking full operational responsibility from Vega C, from France. And the November 2025 ESA Ministerial in Bremen approved 22 billion euros over 3 years, a 30% increase, and Germany is now the largest contributor. For the first time in ESA's history, the agency was given an explicit mandate for non-aggressive defense applications. On the other side, you have the old space Europe. And let me be direct, because I do not believe in mincing words about it. The Ariane model is going to fail. I do not say that with pleasure. I say it because its structural facts are not disputed. Ariane 6 flew in July 2024, 4 years late. Its first commercial flight was in March 2025. As I speak, Ariane 6 has approximately 30 launches in its backlog, of which 13 are reserved, and the Iris Square constellation alone. Iris Square is Europe's answer to Starlink, 290 satellites for 10.5 billion euros, of which 6.5 billion is public money. SpaceX, in preliminary consultations, offered to launch Iris Square much faster and much cheaper. Brussels said no on sovereignty grounds. I respect the sovereignty argument, but understand the cost. Europe is paying a multi-billion euro premium for Iris Square to launch on a rocket that costs more, takes longer, and is built across 13 national supply chains because each member state had to put a coin in a wishing well, wanted their return. And the constellation itself will not be operational until 2030. Starlink already has tens of thousands in orbit and 10 million customers. France, in particular, is in structural bind. France has spent 50 years building Ariane, Airbus Space, and Thales. These are real engineering organizations. There are real engineering talents in them. But the model, government as architect, prime contractor at cost-plus implementation, work distributed by national contribution rather than capability, is the model that the United States moved beyond 15 years ago. And France will not voluntarily surrender it, because Ariane is not just an industrial program in Paris, it is a political identity. So France will fight to defend the old model rather than embrace the new wave coming up behind it. And I'm confident, as a German resident American Turk who watches both ecosystems daily, that France will lose this fight. The question is how much European sovereignty is wasted before Paris admits it. Compare this with the private enterprise in Turkey did with Baykar. Just one moment, because the contrast is instructive. When the United States banned exports of armed unmanned aircraft to Turkey in 2010s, the obvious old model response would have been state prime national champion program, 10 years late, twice the budget, half the capability. That is not what happened. A private family company, founded by Selçuk and Haluk Bayraktar, self-financed since 2003 with no government grants, built the Bayraktar TB2. Today, Baykar holds 65% of the global UAV market. The TB2 is the inventory of 34 countries, including 6 NATO members and 4 EU member states. It crossed 1 million flight hours in late 2024. exported $1.8 billion in 2024, 90% of revenue from exports. And when the war in Ukraine started, Baykar donated TB2s rather than profit from them, gave up over $110 million in revenue because the company would not be a war profiteer. That is what private enterprise enabling sovereign capability looks like. France could have done that with launchers. France chose not to. Turkey chose to. The results speak for themselves. European policy moved hard in 2025, and not because Europe became enlightened. It moved because Europe got two shocks back to back, and both ran through space. The first was Ukraine. From the second day of the war, Starlink became the central nervous system of Ukrainian battlefield. Today, there are over 7,000 terminals in operation across that country. The dependency is total. And in February 2025, after the Trump-Zelensky meeting in the Oval Office and the subsequent pause in the US military aid and intelligence sharing, the question that flashed through every European chancellor was the same. What happens if Starlink is turned off? Germany quietly began financing Ukrainian access to Eutelsat OneWeb as a backup at a significantly higher cost. But OneWeb does not have Starlink's capability, and IRIS² is not in orbit until 2030. Europe discovered in real time that it had outsourced a layer of its strategic communications to a single American company answerable to a single American billionaire. The second shock was the US National Security Strategy released in December 2025, which described the viability of NATO as, quote, an open question. German Chancellor Friedrich Merz called elements of the strategy unacceptable and called for Europe to become much more independent of the United States in security policy. Whether one agrees with those words or not, they are the political reality that European space ministers walked into Bremen with 2 weeks earlier, which is why a 22 billion euro budget passed without a fight. The era in which Europe could buy its strategic space services from American friends was over. Not because the friendship was over, but because the friendship is now considered, on both sides, an insufficient basis for sovereign capability. Exactly the same logic, only sharper, applies in Ankara. How should a nation build sovereign space capability in 2026? 5 points, the way I would write them on a napkin if a minister asked me over a coffee. 1. Government must be an anchor client, not an architect. The single biggest mistake any spacefaring nation can make today is to launch a top-down, government-designed flagship program. Define the mission outcome: sovereign communications, sovereign Earth observation, sovereign access to orbit. Then commit to be a long-term, predictable buyer of those outcomes from private companies. Multi-year contracts, fixed price, shared risk on outcomes. The commercial orbital transportation system that was awarded to SpaceX was the template. Everything that has followed in American new space follows from that very template. And every nation that has refused to learn this lesson, Germany on Minerg is the example, has watched its national champions get acquired by foreign institutions. 2. Vertical integration beats balkanization. The European Ariane model, where the rocket is built across 13 countries because each country that put in a coin in the wishing well is structurally incapable of competing with a vertically integrated company that builds 70% of its rocket in-house. That is not a moral judgment, it is industrial physics. Sovereignty does not require that every component be built domestically. Sovereignty requires that the integration, the systems engineering, and the critical supply chain bottlenecks sit inside companies you can pick up the phone and call. 3. Founder equity, not cost plus. The sovereign program has to make the entrepreneur rich if he succeeds and bankrupt if she fails. Cost plus produces engineering organizations excellent at writing reports and mediocre at delivering results. Equity-aligned founders produce engineering organizations mediocre at writing reports and extraordinary at delivering hardware. Pick which one you want. 4. Iteration over waterfall. Test, fly, fail, fly again. ESA's first flight ended in 30 seconds. The team was back at the pad in less than 9 months. SpaceX lost 3 Falcon 1s before fourth reached the orbit. Starship has had losses that would have ended any traditional program. The question is not whether you fail. The question is the cycle time you put between failure and the next flight. New Space wins on cycle time. And 5, have a few big bets. Not a portfolio of small grants. The temptation in any sovereignty-driven program is spread the money thin, give every regional university a CubeSat budget, and call it an industrial policy. That is not industrial policy. That is a museum. A real sovereignty program picks 2 or 3 private, private national champions, capitalizes them properly, not 5 million euros, but 100 million, and rides them. ESA's launcher challenge maxes at 169 million euros per provider. That is a serious starting number, but to compete with American or Chinese launch capacity at scale, the next stage of European launcher financing will need to be in the billions. And substantial portions will need to come from private capital with the state as anchor customer. That is what we are betting Alpine on. Now finally, let me come home to Turkey. It is not flattery that I say that Turkey has done extraordinary things in space in the last 24 months. The acceleration is genuinely without precedent for a country starting from where we were. On the public sector side, IMECE, the first Turkish-built sub-meter Earth observation satellite. January 2024, Alper Gezer, our first astronaut on Axiom Mission 3. 2 months later, Tuva Cihangir Atasever, suborbital with Virgin Galactic. July 2024, Turksat 6A, the first fully indigenous Turkish geostationary communication satellite, putting us in the company of 11 nations on Earth that can do this. The 2026 National Space and Aviation budget rises to $209 million, up from $140 in 2025, nearly 50% more. The lunar program IOP-1 targets first lunar contact this year. Tuva President has been elected Vice President of the IAC Federation, and Turkey will host more than 10,000 space leaders at the IAC in Antalya this October. But the part of the story that deserves more attention than it has received international is what the private Turkish sector has done in the last 14 months. Fergani Space, founded by Selçuk Bayraktar, yes, the same Selçuk Bayraktar of Baykar, has launched since 2025 a total of 5 satellites and 1 orbital transfer vehicle. FGN 100D1 in January 2025, D2 in November 2025 at 104 kilograms, largest ever private satellite built in Turkey. FGN TUG SC01 on November 28, 2025, the world's first hybrid propulsion orbital transfer vehicle, carrying a Turkish CubeSat as its final deployment. Then FGN 100D3 in March 2026. Every single satellite developed entirely in-house with indigenous avionics, indigenous green propulsion, indigenous software. Fergani's stated goal is to put more than 100 satellites in orbit within 5 years and complete the Ulu Bay global positioning system, which would make Turkey only the 5th nation on Earth after United States, Russia, China, and the European Union, with its own sovereign GNSS. That is a private company saying it will, on its own resources, deliver to Turkey what France and Germany combined needed Galileo to do. Notice that. Notice the structural similarity to what SpaceX did to ULA. Aselsan launched Luna 1 in December 2025 and Luna 2 in March 2026. Domestically developed nanosatellites for secure IoT data transmission. And on December 30, 2025, ground was officially broken on the Turkey-Somalia spaceport, a 900 square kilometer site at 2 degrees north of the equator with a year-round launch weather and open ocean trajectories. That is closer to the equator than ESA's launch site at Kourou. There are perhaps 4 or 5 locations on Earth where you can build a serious equatorial launch site with open water downrange, Turkey, in partnership with a sovereign African nation, just secured one of them. So now let me be prescriptive. Turkey has the rare opportunity to skip a generation. Most countries trying to build sovereign space capability in 2026 will create the European model of 1980s. Turkey does not need to do that. Turkey should do 6 things, and I will be specific. 1. Define the Turkish Space Agency as the anchor customer, not the engineering organization. Long-term, fixed-price contracts to Fergani, Plan S, Aselsan, Roketsan, Delta V, and the next generation of Turkish private space companies. Let TÜBİTAK Space remain a national R&D crown jewel, but the operational fleet through purchase services. Do not repeat the German binary mistake. 2. Capitalize 2 or 3 private Turkish national champions properly, not $5 million grants. Anchor rounds in the $50 to $100 million range, with sovereign and family office Turkish capital leading and institutional capital co-investing. The country has the capital. Mobilize it for industrial sovereignty. 3, and this is a direct ask, make Turkey attractive for foreign space capital. We at Alpine want to invest more in Turkish founders. So do other serious institutional investors. To make that happen, Turkey needs 3 things. A clean foreign capital flow regime for VC investments, an export control regime that allows Turkish-built dual-use technology to reach NATO and EU customers without fear of friction, and equally friendly tax treatment for founders and employees stock option program holders, so the best Turkish engineers stay in private sector champions rather than leaving for state primes. Get those 3 right, and Alpine and our peers will deploy materially more capital here. Get them wrong, and Turkish founders will continue to fly to Munich and Los Angeles to build the companies that should have been built in Istanbul. 4. Turn Anatolia into the testing backbone of European space. Turkey has the land, the engineering talent, the security environment, and the cost base to host static fire stands, structural and environmental test chambers, launch and landing facilities for reusable vehicle testing, and suborbital test ranges for hypersonic and high-altitude programs. Today, European launchers and propulsion programs queue for years at French, German, and Swedish facilities. Turkey can absorb that demand. This is one of the highest leverage industrial offers we can make in this decade, and almost no European country can refuse it. 5, and here's where I want to be direct about Somalia. The Somalia spaceport is a generational asset. We must not let it become a Turkish bureaucratic showcase. We must let it become the fastest executing equatorial launch site on Earth. The right move is to pick one leading European launch provider, and I will say plainly that provider should be Israel Aerospace, and bring them to Somalia for the first European commercial launch from that pad on an aggressive timeline, 18 to 24 months from today. Show the Europeans that we can execute faster than they can. Turkish dynamism is real. Turkish bureaucracy can be real too. Let's make sure the Europeans see the dynamism. One ESAR spectrum launch from a Turkish-built pad would do more for Turkey's position in the European space sovereignty conversation than 10 ministerial communiques. 6, do not subordinate. Partner. Partnership with Europe, yes, 1,000 times yes, but not as a junior. Turkey's industrial base, geographic position, and political will are quite unique assets. The terms of any Iris-Pair successor, any European defense space initiative, any NATO space initiative should reflect Turkey as a co-architect, not a subcontractor. The Turkish defense industry has earned that seat the hard way over the last decade. The Turkish space industry is about to earn it the same way. Let me close where I started. The architects of new space in the United States were entrepreneurs. They were funded by private capital. They were enabled, but not directed, by a sovereign anchor client. They built vertically, they iterated fast, and as a result, today in 2026, the dominant operational space power in the world is, structurally, a private American company, And within 12 months, that company will be partly owned by tens of millions of American retail investors. That is what alignment of capital, citizenry, and strategic capability looks like. There is no law of physics that says that the next architects of new space cannot be Turkish. There is no historical inevitability that says sovereign capability must be only built in California or in Bavaria. The country that that calculated the tilt of Earth's axis 1,000 years ago, that built and operated Turksat 6A and watched its first astronaut return safely from orbit, and that, by the way, in just 14 months, has put 8 indigenous private satellites in orbit and broken ground on its own equatorial spaceport. That country has every ingredient it needs. What it now needs is the patience to fund founders, the discipline to be an anchor client, not an architect, the courage to bet big on 2 or 3 companies, the wisdom to make itself attractive to international capital, and the strategic clarity to use its geography as the lever it actually is. None of this is beyond reach. All it requires is choices to be made in this calendar year. I will be back in Antalya this October at the IAC. Between now and then, I would love to spend my time talking with anyone in this room, government, industry, sovereign capital, family offices, founders, who wants to build a Turkish space industrial base in the way I have described. My team and I at Alpine, our portfolio, are definitely at your disposal. Thank you for the honor of speaking here. Çok teşekkür ederim. I look forward to your questions.
Hi, Brocky speaking. Thank you very much for this inspiring talk. I would like to ask about innovating space and how you convert that and add value to industry. Because once I was speaking to the former director of JPL, and I was like, "Hey, Professor, I'm trying to integrate these codes to upcoming mission, but the prime contractor is putting really high barrier to be able to do that. So there is a chicken and egg problem." Yep. I guess with the minor, you also faced a lot of similar problems. I'd really like to hear how you innovated and converted that into an added value to industry.
Yeah. Well, what you described there, I think, is exactly the kind of trouble that a lot of founders or developers are facing when they are trying to get into what I would say a multi-tiered supply chain. JPL is, after all, a NASA institution, and NASA is the child of course, the Cold War and many other things, and whatever U.S. had to build a strategic asset. It operates still like that. It likes a very distributed supply chain, a very distributed environment, and in your case, a much more rigorous progress for many, many levels to go up to the mission level. What I am talking about is the best way to do what you say today is find your way inside of a vertically integrated organization. One that actually has a quick return cycle from integrating your code, testing it, flying it, and giving you feedback. Trying to get into a national program, especially like that one of JPL, that JPL I have a huge respect for because they do 2-3 year missions to Mars, for example. All the Mars rovers are JPL rovers. They are not the best places to place code in. Their supply chain isn't built for what you want to do. Innovation happens right now in private companies, and that kind of code and that kind of integration happens in private companies, and that's, I actually would say, probably you have a better chance of having your code fly on a Fargani or a TÜBİTAK mission than somewhere on JPL.
Thank you for your insightful talk. I am Fahri. I'm a co-founder of FAAD, FAAD. It's a mini-based space defense startup. I will use the term chicken and egg problem that we are facing, and I would like to hear your insights about it. We are in the process of production of a mean value product, and what we face is we need funding to have more work power, and to develop our product, and we need product to find funding.
Yeah.
And in this cycle, we are struggling, we are pushing all the fronts, but what will be your insights? I would like to hear.
Ah. The first one is actually quite simple. Approach sharks like me that love to talk to people like you. Let's face it. I think what you describe is the typical VC problem, and it's not just in the space industry, right? Anyone who builds any kind of deep tech startup is going to face this founding problem because it's not like something you can build in your garage quickly and hey, I have a code running and I can give you support. There was a real problem in the space sector for that because the problem with the space sector is the fact that most investors are not educated about it. They can't look at a paper and understand the viability. They need well-developed companies way past Series B, Series C to give funding because that's where the risk comes out. They don't have the technical background to actually evaluate what is in front of them. We actually built Alpine Space Ventures exactly to solve that. If you give me a paper, I get to understand it. I got to build these things myself, and my colleagues did the same thing. So, to a certain extent, approach people like me, and I think there's more and more funds now. You're based out of Munich. I know the VC structure there very well. We should exchange offline on that one. But investors like Lakestar, Early Bird, V Squared, they are generalist funds. Most of the time, they throw a deck at me, and we talk with them, and we find funding for you. It's all about conviction. But you're a founder. You have a bifurcated future. It could be a success or failure. That's just the way of founding is. But I think this is just one of those steps you have to take and approach private capital.
Hello, sir. My name is Salih. My question actually aims to more like future engineers slash entrepreneurs. Um, Given your background, you were in United States and funding a startup such as like especially in rocket industry would be more available or more easier in a capitalist system such as United States rather than what we could say a bureaucratic swamp such like Germany. So what was the reason that behind that courage, that motive to back to going back to Germany, funding or working companies like that?
Understand, and it is quite a challenge. I can tell you that. And just to be clear, I invest on both sides, so I get to still see both of them. 3 of my companies are in the U.S., 4 of them are in Europe, and actually 4 of them are in Germany. I see the big difference, and in valuations, in the way people approach companies and whatnot. Why it actually threw me to Europe is the fact that at some point in time, if you have enough pain, you change. And Germany is feeling the pain more than any other very highly industrial European country. What is that pain? When Ukraine got attacked, Germany is the next big country. Like you have Poland in the way, and then you have Germany. France and others are just geographically further away. And Germany, after the Second World War, for all the good reasons, decided defense wasn't their thing they wanted to be involved in. They had a troubled history, so for them, defense was a very, very dirty word. You couldn't actually talk about defense in Germany. That meant they just left it behind. They just completely outsourced space to France. But then they woke up about 4 years ago and realized that France had slept on the job or the European, to be honest, the whole European ecosystem, under that leadership, slept on the job. They just completely gave that job to the Americans. Their rockets were only starting a few times a year. Their capabilities were quite limited. And now when the Russians hacked the first satellite in Ukraine and jammed every other satellite constellation, Starlink was the only solution. And now they were suddenly dependent. And now, in Germany, I go to the Chancellery, I talk to the Chancellor myself, and they understand if a war comes and they think it is viable, they think it can happen. In 2029, they have nothing if the Americans don't help. And that's not a good place to be. You don't want to be the peon on the chessboard that gets played. You want to be master of your own domain. When things like that happen, people change. And I can see that happening in Germany. So I did the venture capital on both sides because I thought I can show success in the US and prescribe and describe what has worked over there and help German environment get to that side. It has a venture capital industry. It has people contributing. It just needs to be pulled into space. It just needs to break its institutional chains. But I think it's happening. It just was that opportunity to see their pain and see if there is that pain that will help us to change the environment.
Değerli konuklarımıza ve bu ilham verici
Distinguished guests, we would like to thank Mr. Bülent for his inspiring speech, and as a memorabilia, we will present him with some gifts.
Değerli izleyiciler, oturumumuz böylelikle sona ermiştir. Hepinize
We've come to the end of our session. Thank you very much for your participation.